Hey, welcome to the first video of a series where I'll be rating a bunch of gacha games that I've played to figure out which ones I should continue playing and which ones I might want to put down for now. Tentatively named, I haven't actually thought of one yet, but maybe by the time I finish editing this video, I'll have figured one out. But feel free to leave your suggestions down in the comments or let me know what you think of the current one, whatever it is. So here's how this series is going to go down. I'll be starting off each review by disclosing when I started playing the game, where I am in the main story, and how much I've engaged with the actual gameplay. This way we can keep track of my opinions and ratings based on what I've experienced in each game, and potentially update them after major updates or simply once I'm caught up. As for the actual review, we'll be rating each game on a scale of 1 to 10 across 5 main categories: the setting, the story, the characters, the gameplay, and the endgame. I'll also be rating the soundtrack and how the music is utilized throughout the game, but this will just be a bonus category that won't count toward the final score. I'll be keeping the reviews as spoiler-free as I can, mainly regarding major narrative shifts and reveals as to not ruin the experience for anyone who might want to give any of these a shot. Naturally, this will prevent me from providing an in-depth review, but I'm fairly certain you'll be able to find many qualified and well-read content creators if that's what you're looking for. And perhaps in the future, I'll cover some particular topics where I won't have that constraint. So without further ado, let's get started with the first game on the chopping block, Honkai Impact 3rd. Like many, Star Rail was my first real introduction to the Honkai universe, and after completing the story on launch, I decided to look into its predecessor, which was in the final weeks of version 6.5. Although, technically speaking, I did download a game called Zombie Gal Kawaii, which I would later learn was technically the first game in the Honkai series, but I promptly uninstalled it after getting barraged by some very questionable notification pop-ups. I don't think there was any story to speak of anyway, so we can kind of just ignore that ever happened. Although speaking of which, the word Honkai is actually kind of a weird English transliteration of the Japanese word Hokai, meaning collapse or destruction. And in Japan, both Zombie Gal Kawaii and its successor, Guns Girl Z, were actually just titled Honkai Gakuen, and Honkai Impact 3rd is actually just Honkai Sado. In fact, the Japanese dub also just calls the Honkai Hokai in-game. Maybe they figured English speakers would read it as Hokei or something? I don't know. Anyway, back to Honkai 3rd. I would read all the way to chapter 10 before I lost steam, and then came back in version 7.1 to read all the way to chapter 25. And as Star Rail's version 2 story came to an end in 2024, they teased us with the cast of Amphorius, the Flame Chasers, and suddenly I was inspired to finish the rest of part 1 before version 3 finally dropped. Sadly, I haven't read anything since then, but I have heard good things about APHO and part 2, so I probably will eventually. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's finally get to the ratings. Starting with the setting. The world of Honkai 3rd has a loosely similar history to ours, but with humanity having struggled for many years to survive under constant threat of the Honkai, a cosmic catastrophe that comes in many shapes and forms, most notably as Hershers, apostles of the Honkai that possess humans to become demigod-like beings. As you play through the game, you'll be introduced to several factions that have come up with their own ways to deal with these disasters. For example, Schicksal, a European organization which mainly makes use of enhanced super soldiers called Valkyries, most of whom are artificially implanted with Honkai-powered stigmata. And as I'm sure you can guess, this carries many risks, such as a reduced lifespan and rapid deterioration of the body. Anti-Entropy, on the other hand, is a research organization that prefers to rely on machines and other technologies utilizing a more refined version of Honkai energy. And lastly, World Serpent is a mysterious organization that plays by their own rules and seems to have a more extreme approach on dealing with the Honkai. And although all of these factions do team up from time to time, their methodologies and end goals don't really align. For a large portion of the game, the perceived setting itself is actually quite narrow. Despite the game taking us all over the globe, we don't really get to experience the entire scope of the world, so it often feels much smaller than it should. This does start to change a little when they introduce the reader to the Sea of Quanta and the Imaginary Tree, but it doesn't exactly get explained very well until much later on. To put it simply, imagine if the World Tree Yggdrasil was born and raised in some fifth dimension of hyperspace and constantly pops out bubble universes into existence that may or may not be related to each other. but cosmic inflation can't quite keep up with the propagation rate of these universes. So to achieve equilibrium, a correctional system manifests itself to effectively test whether each world deserves to continue existing. Now, whether you understood any of that or not, I think you can guess what I'm getting at. The world building gets a little complicated. As the story progresses, you start to learn that it's way more involved than just humans fighting aliens. And for that reason, my rating for the setting will have to be a solid 7 for establishing a fairly cliched setting at the start of the game, but slowly expanding it to a much deeper, more impressive sci-fi scale later on. Moving on, the story of Honkai 3rd primarily follows the students of St. Freya Academy, a sanctuary intended to teach and train survivors of Honkai-related incidents into becoming Valkyries. Among these students are the main protagonist, Kiana, a young girl whose seemingly limitless energy is only matched by her own hubris. Raiden Mei, who you learn had become the Hersher of Thunder a few years prior and was brought to her senses by her then schoolmate, Kiana. Bronya Zajcik, an orphaned assassin turned test subject who lost her capacity for emotions and use of her legs in an experiment she willingly participated in. And Fu Hua, the stoic class president who you learn is actually more deeply involved than she lets on. Leading the troop is Himiko, a decorated veteran Valkyrie and rampant alcoholic, who was actually the one who brought Kiana, Mei, and Bronya to the academy after Mei's awakening as a Hersher. And finally, we have Teresa, a former Valkyrie who is now the principal of the academy, and most definitely not a hag. Okay, she is. Do not be fooled by her cute antics and small stature. She is in her 40s. She's a hag, and that's okay. The story itself is primarily told in visual novel format utilizing the 3D models, and has you explore instance maps to trigger them fairly often. The early chapters actually feel almost frantic when it comes to pacing, blazing through story events with each mission, but then suddenly coming to a halt to do some world building and character introductions, and then throwing you right back to the story at mock speeds. It does eventually start to reach a more comfortable, natural pace, especially leading up to the pivotal events of Chapter 9, but then the following chapters slow things down a bit to hone in on each of the characters individually. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 follow Bronya and reveals her goal of saving her best friend from oblivion. The next several chapters follow a wandering Kiana and her lone encounters with the mysterious World Serpent, as well as Durandal, the famed strongest Valkyrie of Schicksal. Chapters 16 through 19 have you follow Raiden Mei on a journey of self-discovery and new resolve. From Chapter 20, the story finally reveals the many mysteries surrounding Fu Hua, as well as her long history with Otto, the overseer of Schicksal. And all of this culminates in the events of Chapters 24 and 25, with the entire cast working together to take down a newly discovered Hersher plaguing nearby cities. Overall, it's a fairly standard approach, a collection of coming-of-age stories with many themes involving loss, survivor's guilt, self-sacrifice, the importance and meaning of family, betrayal, revenge, and acceptance. And many of these elements are really driven home with the game's use of fully animated cutscenes with arguably some of the most emotionally charged music in the space. If you've ever come across any of the game's animated shorts like Final Lesson, Shattered Samsara, or Everlasting Flames, you probably know what I'm talking about. And then after Chapter 28, the story begins to focus more on the past with lore reveal after lore reveal, all to set the stage for the final confrontation in the present. And this is where the story really starts to shift into science fantasy territory, and I'm gonna have to admit that while some of the earlier chapters tend to constantly switch between expository prose and story development, this is where they really get heavy-handed with information overload. There's a lot of jargon that isn't explained immediately, if at all, and for a long while it'll feel like you're reading the story for an entirely different game. It's not necessarily hard to follow the individual arcs, but the pacing certainly takes a nosedive, and if you aren't all that interested in each of the Flame Chasers and their stories, then it can kind of feel like it just goes on for way longer than necessary. If you've played through Star Rail's Amphoria's story, this will probably sound familiar. Although the Elysian Realm is technically optional content, the third and final chapter does actually lead straight into the events of Chapter 29, so I do actually recommend reading through it if you want the full experience. However, if you find that it's just way too much to read through all at once, you can do what I did, and take your time reading through just one chapter a week, and focus more on the game mode attached to it. This is actually when I started to finally figure out how to play the game, and the roguelite mode was actually kind of fun since it unlocked short interactions between Mei and each of the Flame Chasers for a bit of extra characterization too. Now, I won't go into any detail about how the story of Part 1 ends, but despite how many of these story elements are often predictable and straightforward, the raw emotions and weight behind each of the main characters' developments are really easy to resonate with. The mutual acceptance and trust between the main cast is something I've become very fond of, and I kind of lament the fact that many other games can't achieve this effect due to having a singular main character with a one-size-fits-all blank canvas of a personality. On top of that, the many secondary characters of the game like Himeko, Velt, Otto, Rita, and even Raven have significant roles in the story, and still make appearances throughout the mini arcs when suitable. All in all, I think it'd be a disservice to rate the overall story of Part 1 anything lower than a solid 8, largely being held back by the wild, frantic pacing in some of the earlier chapters, the rampant cases of redundant exposition and long-winded dialogue, and a lot of the gameplay sections feeling drawn out or a little aimless at times. On the other hand, the characters were the main highlight for me, and are what drive all the tension and emotion forward through the story. The writers do a fantastic job at focusing on all the relevant characters, showcasing each one's growths and development as the story progresses. And for that, I had to give the characters an outstanding 9. However, there is quite a bit of extra bias here, as I have in fact read the main manga series, which does a lot of context to many of the characters' backgrounds. I do highly recommend you read through them as an accompaniment to the game, though there are quite a few of them. Also keep in mind that, again, this only covers part 1 of the story. I haven't touched 1.5 or APHO, but I imagine they probably won't affect my initial ratings all that much. Part 2, however, introduces an entirely new cast of characters, and I'll probably have to make a separate video for that much later on. And finally, we can move on to the gameplay, which I admittedly haven't engaged all that much with outside of the story. I never really added the game to my daily routine, so I have a very limited experience with the gacha aspect of the game to begin with. The game itself is very generous with resources and characters, and from what I understand, it's very easy to play completely free to play. The combat itself is surprisingly satisfying, but you can really tell how dated the game is when you're forced to play any of the older characters, especially when it comes to things like sound effects, weight, or the sense of impact. As a side note, as someone who generally prefers keyboard and mouse controls for games like Genshin, Wuthering Waves, Zenless Zone Zero, and Punishing Grey Raven, I really do think controller is the way to go for this game. I mainly attribute it to the lack of control over the camera when in combat, so it feels more natural to just let the game take over for the most part. When it comes to actual gameplay, most characters have a very limited set of attacks and are generally intuitive enough that you'll probably figure out how to play them just by trying different button combinations and holding some buttons down when it feels like there's something vital missing. There are some more involved kits that may require a round of tutorials or two, and for the more complex teams, you might actually want to refer to a video guide for optimal rotation. That said, there isn't really a need outside of the endgame modes for the most part, and there are very few times in the story where you actually have to lock in. The QTE system is a little similar to Zenless's Quick Assists or Wuthering Waves intro system, depending on the character, with many of them applying buffs, debuffs, statuses, or providing extra resources, or triggering large bursts of damage, all while slowing down time for a few seconds. Each character has specific QTE triggers too, such as when statuses are applied, or time slow is activated when a weapon skill is used, and so on, so it's helpful to be aware of them to optimize rotations and field time. And lastly, I have very little experience with endgame content, so while I can't give a proper informed rating, I have heard that since it's got a leaderboard system with tiered rewards for the Abyss and Memorial Arena, it's fairly accessible, with the increase in rewards only being marginally better as you get higher in ranks. That said, if you're the competitive sort, the top ranks of players have, either spent a lot of money or have just been playing the game for a long time, probably both, so I probably wouldn't go too far with it. Also, there are some interesting game modes as well, like Elysian Realm, a roguelite that offers some fairly standard fare bonuses that can lead to some pretty hilarious results, like achieving full invulnerability by looping combos and spamming ultimates. So overall, I'd rate the gameplay a 6 as of now. I wouldn't be surprised to see it go up to a 7 once I get to try some of the more recent characters, especially from part 2. As for endgame, since the gameplay is fairly straightforward, I feel like it doesn't really allow for a lot of flexibility or skill expression, so I'll have to give it a preliminary score of 5. This is naturally subject to change as well, assuming I ever engage with the endgame on any significant level, but if you've participated in, please feel free to weigh in on this. Now, before I close the curtains on this review, I would like to point out that the music used in this game is actually quite good. A lot of gameplay sections do have very unremarkable synth-heavy tracks just there to fill the empty space, but there are also quite a few interesting ones that do a decent job with matching the tone of the scenes or environment, especially when they start utilizing fuller orchestral sounds. A lot of the later boss fights also have some exceptional tracks as well, but they often fail to leave a lasting, memorable impression. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as game soundtracks mainly serve as a way to immerse you more deeply into the setting, and not necessarily worm their way into your ears and have you humming the melody all day. That said, when it comes to the animated shorts, I have to admit, they all hit. The atmospheric melancholy leading into the heavy, emotional chorus in the final lesson's Nightglow hits at just the right time, but then leaves you feeling empty and alone after it's all said and done. The hauntingly ephemeral and tranquil Rubia from Shattered Samsara maintains an almost wistful tone, but then builds into a very powerful, emotional ballad, and then resolves beautifully right at the end. Moon Halo from the animated short Everlasting Flames starts as a somber yet hopeful piece, but then transitions into a full-on rock ballad. And with the lyrics making references to those found in prior animated shorts, it leaves you with this lasting impression that everything has led up to this one moment. And right at the very end, the entirety of Graduation Trip is just a masterpiece from start to finish, managing to showcase the entirety of the story in a meaningful way. And from the moment the first notes of Capo lands, it really truly feels like the journey is coming to an end, and you can't help but feel like a proud parent looking back at all the things the characters have gone through and achieved. Also, as a cherry on top, I highly recommend watching the Forest Capriccio performance of Capo maybe a week or two after you finish part 1. I don't think a single track from a game has ever hit me as hard as this one, and it terrifies me to wonder if anything ever will. And for those very reasons, I have to give the music in this game a very respectable 8 overall. Despite the repetitive tracks used in the gameplay section of the story, the music used in the animations really leave a profound, lasting impact on the way the story is experienced, and I simply can't overstate it enough. Alright, so let's wrap this up. With a 7 for setting, an 8 for story, and a 9 for characters, I would give the overall narrative experience a total rating of 24. And with a 6 for gameplay and 5 for my slightly underinformed opinions of the endgame, the entire gaming experience gets a total of 11. Ultimately, I do think Honkai 3rd is well worth reading through if you can manage to become attached to his cast of characters, though it may take a while to get there. And naturally, I enjoyed it much more when I was actively invested in the story and didn't feel forced to get through the boring sections just to get to the good parts. However, the gameplay and daily routine is unfortunately not doing it for me, and I don't think it's worth getting into if you're a completely new player unless you really like the combat or the characters, especially considering the competition out there. But if you're into it, more power to you. And of course, my ratings are always subject to change, especially if there are aspects of the game I haven't even gotten to full experience yet, and I may update the scores in future videos. But as the date of posting, these are my personal opinions based on my personal experiences with the game. And of course, I'd love to see your ratings in the comments too, and maybe something noteworthy about the game that stood out to you, good or bad. And there's no need to try to take an agreeable, objective stance. I feel like when it comes to video games, you should always rate them subjectively because everyone experiences them in different ways, focusing on different things. Maybe you didn't really like the story, but really loved the music. Maybe you loved the story, but hated the combat. Maybe you've only watched the animated shorts and read summaries online and only have a surface level understanding of the story. And honestly, that's fine too. The point of this video is to try to convince you to pick this up or put it down. I simply want to note down my opinions and just share my thought process with you. And as always, if you've made it to the very end, thank you so much for listening. I'll probably be sticking to a format similar to this for future reviews, but let me know if you have any suggestions. And with that, I hope to see you soon for my next one. Keep reading, enjoy some games, and have a good one. Cheers!
Like a flower far away, all by the road, waiting for the one to find a way back home. Time flows across the